Every now and then, you just need a solid fantasy series, and that is exactly what I got with the Winnowing Flames trilogy by Jen Williams. So we're talking about the Ninth Reign, the Bitter Twins, and the Poison Song. What is this trilogy about? So I'm going to try and set the stage. We're talking alternate fantasy, alternate world, and we're looking at a world where there are these things called reigns, and each reign is an apocalyptic event. So throughout history, 8 of these reigns have happened, and when a reign happens, essentially there's these bug-like creatures which come and basically just try to kill everyone. They're brutal, they're vicious. It's horrifying some of the things that have happened there, and what happens is when these bug-like creatures comes, there's these other people on the planet called abhorrents, and they're essentially like vampires, but they ride these giant war beasts and they fight these bug-like creatures off. So this has happened, the eighth reign was hundreds of years ago, and we start the story following a lady named Vintage, and Vintage is so cool. She's like a middle-aged architect, and she's just such a sweetheart, and I love following Vintage. So anyway, we're following Vintage, and she is not an architect; she's an archaeologist. So she's going around trying to investigate the eighth reign, like what happened those hundred years ago, and she's trying to find all of these artifacts. And she meets some friends, and some things start happening, and potentially we might be looking at the ninth reign coming, which is obviously a big deal in this world. Now the problem is the abhorrents, or the people who would have fought off these bug creatures, they're all dying. This is also part of the history. There's very rich history in this series where these abhorrents, they've basically contracted a sickness for interesting reasons, and yeah, they're mostly gone. So now the question is, who is going to fight off these bug creatures when they come and when the ninth reign starts? So I mean, that's sort of the premise of the story. I would say that this series is really well known for its world building, and world building is such a strange term when people use it, because to me it's kind of like that's a verb, but everyone always uses it as it's a noun. And to me, there's like two different facets of that. There is the world itself, which is created. Like, do you as a reader find the world interesting? Do you find it, like a, a compelling place for the story to take place? And does the world feel real? Does it feel lived in? And then there's the act of actually world building. Like, how is the world presented to you? How does the author get that information across to you? Are there info dumps? Or do you learn about it through conversations? Or do you know what I mean? So there are two different facets to it. I think Jen Williams did an amazing job in both ways. This is a world which feels very full, very rich, lots of history. It doesn't feel shallow, it feels lived in. There are a lot of different cultures, a lot of different things happening, but they all feel very integrated together. And then the other part of it is it's just so interesting. It's so creative, like some of the things that happen in this world. But then she also presents it in such an excellent way. There are no crazy info dumps. There's no tedious passages of description for you to slog through. It's just the characters just know the world as it is, and they just live in it naturally. But you learn about it slowly. You learn about the world as more mysteries are unraveled through our archaeologist character Vintage. So I think the world building in this was exceptional. It is definitely a highlight of the series. But I think what people understate is just how good the series is otherwise. It's a very compelling plot. It drives forward. It's got these awesome characters. Like one of my favorite characters is an archaeologist, a middle-aged woman named Vintage. I think she's such a sweetheart. She was so much fun to follow. There's a motley crew, some really great character interaction, some great relationships, and then the plot, like I said, it's very driving. And there's, despite the fact that there are some awesome action scenes with some crazy visuals, there's also a lot of slower moments, a lot of time spent with just characters talking to each other, going over what they've gone through. I think that it's just really well balanced between all three books. I found I found the first book, I think, to be my favorite, but it was very solid throughout. Like, I didn't really, maybe book two was a slight step down, but it wasn't significant. And then, the series ended with such a bang that, yeah, I really enjoyed this. There were parts of it which kind of reminded me of Sanderson. I found the prose and the writing style to be much more compelling than any Sanderson book I've read. It's not like GGK or anything, but it's just really good and fun to listen to or to read. I actually did this in audiobook, and it was excellent audio. I found the characters to be great. There were a lot of parts of the story which reminded me of Hob, specifically thematically, and specifically with Hob, I'm talking about um, the Live Ship Traders and the Rainwild Chronicles, where we're talking about the power of memory and the connection between memory and identity, because there's a lot of those themes that are brought up in this story as well. It's thematically rich, and overall I just found the Winnowing Flames to be a very, very solid fantasy trilogy. I would highly recommend it. After the Winnowing Flames trilogy, I read Legacy of the Brightwash. This one is a bit of an indie darling. I think it's very well loved in the indie fantasy community. So I knew I had to give it a shot, and I was super excited to get into it, and it did not disappoint. What is Legacy of the Brightwash about? So we follow this man named Tashwe, and Tashwe used to be in the army, but now he works as a regulation officer for this thing called the Authority. And the Authority basically is an agency which governs these people called the Tainted in this world. It's like a Gaslamp fantasy world. And the Tainted are basically the magic users. These are people who were born with random abilities that they have differing amounts of power and control over. And so the Authority makes sure that they are registered, makes sure that they are following the laws specifically set out for them, and make sure they don't do anything bad, essentially, because they're very looked down upon in this world. And Tasha's job as a regulation officer is he's basically given like 40, 50 of these people, these cases, and he's in charge of them. Like, he's meant to check up on them, he's meant to make sure everything's going okay, meant to make sure that they're following the laws. If they do anything bad, then he has to be the one that deals with the situation, as it were. And Tasha is the kind of guy who, for a long time, he's had complete faith in the law. He's been like, he does everything by the book, even when that means hurting his own family for some things that happened in the past. But in recent times, his faith in the law starts getting challenged, and for reasons that happened before this story. But then it really starts getting challenged when he finds a little tainted girl washed up, dead and mutilated by the river Brightwash, interestingly. And that's when he starts challenging his own faith in the law, and the plot goes from there. So the overall plot of the story, it is a murder mystery, but it's really not focused on that. It's kind of just this thing in the background which keeps on plotting, because what the story is really about, it's about what you do when the foundations of your beliefs are shaken, right? It's about the inner conflicts that arise from something like that. It's finding new purpose in life, or like changing your purpose in life. And it's about finding love in a very broken world. This story is very, very character driven. It is 100% like focused, dialed in, zeroed in on the characters. We talked about world building in the Winnowing Flames. This is very light on world building. There's not a lot of time spent describing the city. There's very little time spent describing settings. In fact, that was one of the most interesting things when I read this book, is I realized I am able to fill in most of the setting myself in my head. Like, I'm not that visual of a reader. I think if you are a very visual reader, you might not like this book, because there's basically no time spent describing settings. Like, we start in one scene where we have conversations between this set of characters. We go to the next scene, we have conversations between this set of characters. And it's all about relationships. This is about a bunch of very broken people and how they interact with each other, how much history there is between them. That's one of my favorite things about this story, was just the depth of history between these characters, and like how well they know each other and all of the things they've been through. And then you start seeing some of that change, right? You start seeing the tensions that come because of that history, and also because of world events or whatever people are getting dragged into. So there's politics, there's some intrigue, but again, it's really focused on the characters. And I think at the heart of the story is a romance, which I thought was just amazing. I thought this is one of the best romances I've read, where it's definitely not like sold as a focus of the story. Like, this isn't a romantasy, but I think this romance is just so compelling and so wonderful that it's what really drove me through this story. And it is, between two amazing characters with so much depth and personality to them. Yeah, I think that, I don't want to say too much, because I think this story is very hard to describe, but it is one of those where I think going in blind, just allowing yourself to spend time with these characters who you may not like, right? Like, they're all very flawed individuals. So you may end up not liking some of these characters, but just spending time and understanding them and seeing how real they feel. Because I think that's one thing which this author, they did very well, was just making the characters feel human, and these are definitely humans. I think if I had to say one interesting thing about the story is just how horny everyone is. So there's like, this is one of those things where, you know, people have different opinions on how much they care about this kind of stuff. I think for me, it was a little bit of a detractor. It was like, these are very, very horny characters, and they're very sexually liberated as well, which is kind of interesting and cool in its own way. But it's one thing which I didn't quite relate to. I was like, really? Like, you're just constantly thinking about this stuff. And they're also all very hot, or at least everyone really likes the protagonist. I guess he must be like super hot. That's how I'm picturing him in my head. But you know, that's just, I think, a very interesting part of this world where it is very sexually liberated, and there's characters who use sex for, you know, various purposes. I thought that was kind of interesting and a little bit different. A little bit of a detractor for me personally, but I think other people love that stuff, so it's all good. That said, it was still such a compelling and beautiful story because the characters just felt so human and so real. And now I want to know what happened in the next book. You know, like I've heard good things about that one as well. And yeah, like this is thematically rich, character-driven fantasy at its best. Yeah. So now I'm going to talk about Sailing to Sarantium. So I'm part of a buddy read on this one with a whole bunch of people, and this is my second GGK read. The first one I've read was A Brightness Long Ago. I don't want to go into too much in depth because I got to save some stuff for our conversation. Suffice it to say, I really like this. I thought it was wonderfully written. I think I'm getting more used to GGK now, and he is such a great writer. Like, it's just, you know, it's just next level sometimes. I thought that Sailing to Sarantium, the first 10 to 15% was extremely rocky. Like, we're talking very hard to get into. There were such convoluted sentences, just on a sentence by sentence level. You have like sentences which are in entire paragraphs long. I'm like, why did you do it like that? And it was all very confusing. There's like a billion POVs introduced. It's very chaotic. I mean, surely an author of this caliber does that intentionally, right? And I felt lost in chaos, and lost in the chaos, which I think was intentional. It must have been. So yeah, but I could totally see why someone would pick this up and then DNF it after like 5%. But if you push through that, if you push through the first 10-15% and you start like just you push through that 10-15%, and then it becomes a very intimate story, because then instead of a billion characters, you're mostly only focusing on one character and following him. And that's when I just started loving it, because I like, so we're following a man named Crispin, and Crispin is a mosaicist, and essentially this is sort of like a Byzantium-ish era world called Sarantium, I think. And so essentially Crispin is called to the court of the emperor to build a mosaic, and that's basically where the story goes. So there's some political intrigue, and you know, there's some interesting fantasy-ish stuff that happens on the way there. I loved Crispin. He's a hot-headed guy. I love hot-headed characters. It's just always so funny and interesting. You know, the shenanigans they get up to. So it was really compelling. I enjoyed it a lot. I think comparing this to the one other GGK read I have, which is A Brightness Long Ago, I did not like it as much as A Brightness Long Ago, because I think A Brightness just had a lot of experimentation in it. There were a lot of POV shifts. There was a lot of tense shifts, a lot of like very interesting writing. And overall, it just gave A Brightness this sense of this magical sense to the writing. You know, it was so compelling to read it. But at the same time, I found Sailing to Sarantium to be much more readable, like much easier to read, if that makes sense. It was easy to follow. It just felt like a more ordinary fantasy story. Both of them excellent. I'm super excited for book 2 of this duology. Yeah, can't wait to get into it and have that discussion with all these friends. I know Nico wasn't as big of a fan of this one, so I think we have some beef to hash out, and we're gonna see how that goes. So then, because it's November, I thought that this year I would try my best to read a few wartime historical fiction stories in November, and I started with All Quiet on the Western Front. So this one, I think I read it a long time ago when I was back in high school or something, and I don't think I really understood it. You know, it was, I don't know. I don't remember it leaving that much of an impact on me, but when I read it again just pretty recently, a few days ago, I finished. It was just so harrowing. I was crying at least twice while reading this book because it was just so powerful. You know, this is the story of a German soldier in World War Front on the Western Front, and basically his company of classmates who become veterans in the trenches, and it's it's written almost like journal entries. I think it is written like journal entries from this soldier's perspective over the years of the war, and it just takes you through the ringer. You know, it just captures all the experiences of it. It captures the companionship, the camaraderie between these young soldiers. And then it captures when they go home for leave, like how weird it feels to be at home, how other people treat them, and like he just doesn't feel like he belongs at home. But the front is terrifying as well, and there's this sense of non-belonging that these poor boys had, and this story was so powerful because there's a certain authenticity, right? Like this was written, I think it was like in 1929 by someone who fought in the war, and you can tell that there's authenticity there. Like no one now could write a story like this, right? Like this, you had to be there, and it's just heartbreaking. Yeah, it's heartbreaking. So, I mean, I think I almost feel like this is a must read, right? Like All Quiet on the Western Front. I think everyone should read that book. There's this one quote I wrote here, which I just thought was so powerful. So I'm gonna read it out loud and gonna embarrass myself if I start crying. But these voices, these quiet words, these footsteps in the trench behind me recall me at a bound from the terrible loneliness of fear and death by which I had almost become destroyed. They are more to me than life, these voices. They are more than motherliness and more than fear. They are the strongest, most comforting thing there is anywhere. They are the voices of my comrades. So, after finishing that one, I moved on to A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemmingway. This one I'm finding less instantly compelling. I think just the writing in All Quiet on the Western Front just really touched me. But it's really interesting. You know, Hemingway has got such a unique style. He's got very stunted sentences, very like punchy dialogue, and it's really interesting. So I'm enjoying it. I don't know if it's a favorite just yet. I just started pretty recently, so we're gonna see. The other one I'm reading is City of Thieves by David Benioff, and I really like this one. It's actually, you know, it's dark. This is about the siege of Leningrad, and it's about two young boys in that siege who are sent on a quest to find eggs, which is very strange and interesting. And I found that, you know, even though it's very dark and there's crazy, horrible things happening, there's also an airy tone to City of Thieves. You know, it's a story where the characters are just joking around with each other and they have such fun dialogue that I'm really enjoying it. So we'll see how that goes. And yeah, so that's where I'm at right now. I'm gonna try to read a few more wartime books this November and hopefully get to some other fantasy later. And that's it for my update. I hope you guys have been having some awesome reading, and I wish you all the best for the festivities to come in December and November. Have a good one, guys.